you are a Benbite, is that correct? You were born and raised at Sinai Temple?
That is correct.
So what are some of the first memories that you have? And it's not even in this building, correct? Because Sinai Temple was in one of our other locations, correct?
Correct. So this goes back to 4th in New Hampshire. And the year is either 1958 or 1959. I'm 7 or 8 years old. And my mother actually was hired to teach in the Sunday school. She was hired by Hannah Lippert, and that was 1956. So that's when our family became affiliated with Sinai Temple. And in 58 or 59, so I was 7 or 8, and my parents decided to bring me for the High Holy Days to the synagogue. But when we came up the steps, now this was on the 4th Street side, and there were 3 steps going up to that entrance, which was the entrance not just to the sanctuary, but it was also the entrance to the office building part, the office part, and the school part. And they wanted me to go to the children's service. And I was really reticent about it. I was really hesitant. And I told them that I remember this, I told them that I wanted to be with them. And so my mother acquiesced, and I went and sat with them in our seats in the balcony. And my mother's hand always on my thigh, ready to pinch if she just even thought that I was going to say something, just for me to be quiet. So at some point during services, I did whisper to her, "Mommy, who are those voices? Where are those voices coming from?" And the choir loft, the organ and the choir loft were above the bima, and today you can see into the choir loft there. But at the time, there was still another facade above the railing.
And this is the building on 4th in New Hampshire, correct? So the second home of Sinai Temple, which is now a Korean Christian church, correct?
Yeah, Korean Presbyterian.
Korean Presbyterian Church,
Correct.
yes.
Correct. And that building was built in 1925, and we were there from 1925 to 1960. So you couldn't see the singers or the organist, but of course you could hear everything. And so I had asked, who are those voices? And the other recollection from that time was the distinctive smell. Because the building, of course, was not air conditioned.
Yes.
So it was a combination of sweat and perfume and cologne and all of that mixed together, and it was warm and a little on the sticky side. But that kind of memory also sticks with you.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
And it actually carried over here because this building was also built without air conditioning.
Oh, so a later addition to the building.
Yeah, I'll get to that.
So actually, a couple of questions about that, because looking back on it now, to think of a conservative synagogue that had a professional cantor, I mean, cantors were common, but to have an organ and a professional quartet, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, not just male singers, but female and male singers, that was what you grew up with. But now looking back on that, was that something that's very special in the conservative movement?
It was special in the conservative movement to people in the East, because the conservative synagogues in the East were much more on the conservative side.
So no instruments.
Most of the synagogues in the East, the conservative synagogues in the East, did not have accompaniment.
Correct.
But they did here in the West Coast, almost from the beginning. Bethel had accompaniment. Beth-Am had accompaniment. Valley Beth Shalom had and has accompaniment.
Of course. But we were the first, because we were the first conservative synagogue on the West Coast. So that must have been a very, a wonderful opportunity for those conservative Jews who maybe weren't used to the West Coast sound.
That's correct. Also remember that this was the second building. The first building at 12th and Valencia was also built with an organ. So there was organ accompaniment right from the very beginning. And it was something that the forefathers of the synagogue thought about and wanted to include right from the beginning.
And that organ still sounds.
Yes, it's a Murray Harris organ that is still playing today in its original condition.
So was it always an electrical organ, or was there someone there pumping the bellows?
No, that was always
electric.
Yeah, that always had a blower motor.
And then the organ at 4th in New Hampshire, can we hear the story behind that too? Because I know that's a very a wonderful story about that.
That's a Robert Morton theater organ, and it's funny because the Murray Harris Company, which eventually went defunct, was purchased, and a subsequent purchase, it ended up being the Robert Morton Company. So I found that out almost by accident. A book had been written by Orpha Oxy, which is known among the AGO people, quite a historian and musicologist, wrote a book on the history of some of the organs here in Los Angeles, and that was included. And I had also sent a copy of that portion about the organ to Craig Taubman.
Oh, wonderful.
So that he would know for the Peak Reunion project.
Yes, because now the original building at 11th and Valencia, or 12th and Valencia, is now the Pico Union project ever since 2013. So kind of full circle, which is really wonderful.
So the Robert Morton organ, which was installed sometime after 1925 when the 4th New Hampshire Sanctuary was built. But it was built and designed to house an organ because organ chambers were actually built into the walls on both sides of the choir loft for the organ to actually speak into the room. And the lattice work is still there.
So many of us, especially in the industry and who love organ and organ music, are familiar with the instrument of the organ, but can you maybe talk a little bit about what is an organ? Why does it need to breathe? What are these pumps and blowers? And I thought it's all on the keyboard. How does an organ work?
Then we have to talk about a couple of my teachers.
We shall.
But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more about the comment I made. Who were those voices?
Yes, the choir.
And they were beautiful voices, and especially the soprano. And I had just always tried to imagine in my mind what these people would look like. I mean, I couldn't even fathom. And then fast forward to 1975, when I become the organist and choir director of Sinai Temple, that several members of that quartet were members of the quartet that, I don't know how else to say, that I inherited.
Still, after
Yes.
20, it was 20 years later, no? Or roundabout?
Estelle Marlov
was
the soprano. Nancy Nash was the contralto. Larry Wolliver, who did not end up coming to this building, neither did the bass, but the two women did. And I ended up conducting some of the same singers that I had heard from when I was a child, when I had asked my mother that question. And those four singers that were the Sinai Choir in 1975 were also the singers that had been conducted by Max Helfman.
Max Helfman.
Who was here in the late 50s.
And Max Helfman is one of the most important names in Jewish music. I mean, he's responsible for the Havienu, the Shema Kolenu that we sing during the high holidays, but he was our organist for, I believe, 5 years in the 1950s.
For several years in the late 50s. It was a combined position that was made for him, combined by Sinai Temple and the University of Judaism, which is now the
AJU. Yes.
And as you know, I think you know, that the University of Judaism was originally started and housed at Sinai Temple at 4th and New Hampshire.
Oh, wonderful.
That's how close the relationship was at the time, yes. And so in order to create a living wage for Max Helfman, he was made the Dean of Fine Arts at the University of Judaism, as well as the music director at Sinai Temple. So between those two combined positions was a living wage. And the same thing was done for my predecessor, Erwin Josby, who also knew.
So he was the subsequent dean after Max Helfman, correct?
Yeah, Erwin Josby.
Erwin Josby.
Then succeeded him and became the Dean of Fine Arts.
Yes.
Dean Erwin Josby.
Dean.
Yeah.
I mean, all these wonderful names, but even before we get to specific names, I'm wondering what it was like for you, because clearly the music of Sinai Temple and Jewish music had such a profound impact on you as a child. How did that change being a consumer of the Jewish music to actually being a creator of Jewish music when you took over the reins in 1975? Did it take away some of the magic? Did it add to the magic? What was that change in that experience?
You had asked me about the organ, and I want to answer that question. But to answer this question, I started attending services regularly when I began working with Cantor in 1970, just right around there. And just his piousness, his stateliness, how genteel he was, how he emoted, and sitting there in Section A, I always pretty much sat in the same place. And as a matter of fact, and Ruth Pilot tells the story, I sat next to Ruth Pilot very often, also when we came to listen to Cantor. And of course, the quartet and Erwin playing and conducting. It's a special experience here, and of course the magnitude really of this sanctuary, the magnitude of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and the magnitude of Sinai Temple in a different way, but still, you walk in and you're still awestruck, and I still am, even after all of these years. It's a special and an amazing place. Not just for the building, but also for the people over all of these years that I've come in contact with. But Cantor was talk about Ahavat Torah. That's what he imbued, and how he taught the children. So it was very, very special.
So can you maybe talk about what was it like to walk in those doors when this building first opened in the 1960s? What did it look like? Who was here? How did they dress? What did it smell like? The clergy wore robes. It was very regal, very formal. I want to know what was that like?
It was very, very formal. And also, when I was little and we came into the sanctuary, most of the time it was with our Hebrew school class, because in those days, listen to me, in those days, Hebrew school was Monday, Wednesday, and Shabbat and Saturday.
Shabbat.
Or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. You had one of the two tracks that the families could choose from. And every Saturday, the classes took turns being brought into the sanctuary, and we sat in the back of Section D, and at the end of the service, it was timed for us to come in towards the end, so everybody didn't get spilkedick, right?
Spilkedick.
So we would be brought into that section, which would be roped off for our class or classes, and the rabbi would take a moment and actually address us. And so we became used to actually coming into the sanctuary by coming in on a regular basis. So it was not foreign to us at all. I almost kind of wish that we still could do that we still could do religious school and have the school classes come in on a rotating basis like that, because I think the children still would have the opportunity to become more acquainted, and the place would feel more like home.
So was there participation in the service by religious school students, or was it more of, you got to be addressed by the rabbi for attending?
We were addressed by the rabbi, but we had already had our own service.
Okay.
For which was junior congregation, and all of us had to attend that. And junior congregation was run by Tommy Smotrich.
Tommy Smotrich, yes.
Yes. And in the temporary chapel, which was located almost where Cohen Chapel is now, it was part of the motel structure that was there on the corner.
So that's interesting to note too, is that Sinai Temple that we sit in now came in multiple phases. So the big, huge building that we see right now, it wasn't like that when this building opened in, was it Shavuot of 1960 or 61?
60, I believe.
1960.
There were low-rise apartment buildings from the corner up until where the property for the motel was. And so of course, they were all demolished, and then the sanctuary in Ziegler Hall was built first. And then there was
An alley, right?
there was a blacktop area, which was the parking area, and then there was a low-rise motel building, and that's where the offices were. And then there were carports with rooms above the carports. And the rooms is where the custodial staff and the other things were.
Is this on the Wilshire side or on the Ashton side?
This was the corner of Wilshire and Beverly Glen, the actual corner.
The actual
of Wilshire and
corner,
Beverly
wow.
Glen. And the carports were glassed in and made into classrooms.
Wow.
So that's where our Hebrew classes.
Oh my goodness.
That's where we went to Hebrew school. That's where Howard and I went to Hebrew school. And the custodians lived upstairs. And services at that time were very, very formal. Men had to wear suits and ties, and most of the time came with hats.
Hats.
Yes. And there was a hat room, which was part of the bride's room as you entered. And there was originally a roll-down gate there. And all of that was kind of changed a little bit. And then the tribute, Ruth Merritt's tribute to the 6 million was put on the wall there. Women wore gloves, mandatory. Women wore gloves and mandatory hats. I mean, it just was. You didn't even think about how you were going to come dressed for services. And the sanctuary did not have air conditioning. And at that time, there were 10, and I know that. I remember because I counted them. There were 10 huge fans on big pedestals. Huge. Spaced 5 on one side against the wall by section A, and then 5 on the other side against the wall by section D, and you could hear the whir of the fans. And that's all we had. In addition, there was heat, so there was a ventilation system up on the roof.
But no air conditioning until years later.
The head of maintenance at the time, Al Mayhew, carried 100-pound blocks of ice on his back up the catwalk steps, up to where the wall is housed, and the fans would blow on those blocks of ice to try to create some amount of chilling. And that's who did that, Al Mayhew. There's a few who still are around who may remember him.
I'm trying to imagine all the women here wearing gloves and hats, and I would say it's unimaginable because I'm actually here 10 years next year. It started in 2012, and the only person that I remember who still would come into services before pandemic with hat and gloves is Frances Katz. So I can imagine all the ladies dressed impeccably, just like Frances. So I'm wondering, maybe even from that time, are there some legendary figures, some legendary historical figures of Sinai Temple, some friends or family that you were close to, kind of like represented the essence of who Sinai Temple was, and maybe a couple stories about them?
The first woman president of Sinai Temple, Doris Siegel, always wore hats. And she wore gloves too. That eventually she stopped, but she always wore hats to the end of her days till she stopped, being able to come. And the hats always went with every single outfit, as did with Francis Katz.
Yes.
So there were a few like that who maintained that tradition for themselves, I think, more than anything else. But still, it was always nice to see. I'm trying to remember his name right now. He was at the mortgage burning ceremony for the 4th and New Hampshire mortgage, and he sort of fashioned himself to be a Jewish cowboy. He always wore Western suits, and he had a meatpacking business in Downey. And when he came into and had beautiful white hair, when he came into the sanctuary, he came into the sanctuary. Really quite something. The name will come to me. But we had quite a few personalities here. Roy Buttons was members here, for some period of time. Of course, you know about the Douglas family.
Of course.
And Edie Gourmet and Steve Lawrence were members here. Both of their boys.
Every year we read Sammy Davis Jr. as part of our yard site list, and I'm not sure if he was a member here. He converted, was Jewish, but I think maybe one of our members had purchased a plaque for him. Correct?
It was actually Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet and their friends who had purchased that.
Wonderful.
Yes.
I know we always get
story behind
always get eyebrows like Sammy Davis Jr. So what about the clergy? What were the clergy like at Sinai Temple?
Rabbi Chodas originally was a very tall, strapping man, and had a baritone speaking voice and had a very distinctive laugh. I remember as a little boy being outside, and he would come out after services in his black robe, which would be flowing with the wind, and I just remember seeing that. He was a musician. He played the violin, and I've never been able to find another copy of it. There was one in the file, but it's gone. And he wrote actually a setting for May the Words.
Really?
But I don't know where it is. And his family was musical. One son of his, Gabriel Chodas, was a piano teacher of mine. I think my mother had made the inquiry, when she was working here, and he helped Cantor teach the music in the school and so on. And so he was my second piano teacher, but my first real, technical instruction, on the piano.
What are the differences between piano instruction versus organ instruction? Can any pianist be an organist? Can any organist be a pianist? What was that like in your training?
Usually it's from piano to organ. It's usually not the other way around. But they're two entirely different disciplines. Of course, when you learn to play the piano, you have the grand staff and notes and so on, and a certain technique that goes with learning to play the piano. There's also techniques that go with learning to play the organ. One of those is finger substitution in order to have everything sound smooth and legato. Otherwise, it's going to sound very choppy.
Maybe now is when you can talk about how an organ works and why that's the case.
Yeah, and my teachers you know, who, my first piano teacher, my first real life-changing piano teacher, who I stayed with for 20 years, Brigida Leolausis, was an amazing person. And she studied with Walter Gieseking, and she had studied with Walter Schnabel. So the technique that she learned from them, she imbued to me. And during that course of those years, when I was a teenager, she had said to me, you know, you really should be studying theory and, you know, musicianship and harmony and counterpoint, and I have somebody for you to work with, and I'm putting together some classes of some of my students, and I want your mother to, of course, she gave me the number, and she put it in my manuscript book. I showed it to my mother. My mother started me in classes, and I guess I was about 14, and I studied with this woman whose name was Patty Perry. It's now Patty Secrece. I studied with her for 5 years, and she took me all the way from traditional harmony, all the way through counterpoint and beginning arranging, and also the musicianship studies that went with that, ear training, dictation. She could handle my temperament, and she knew that I had perfect pitch. And at some point, I was actually in one hearing writing out 8 measures of a 4-part Bach chorale. That's how good I got. And then she would play A, then she would play the tonic triad, and she would say, I'm going to play another 8 measures of a chorale, and you're going to write it out a half a step lower.
Oh.
And she did that in order for me to get away from perfect pitch and to use relative pitch. And thank goodness she kept at it with me, because
That is not easy.
it worked. And then she would have me sit down, and she would sit on the couch across the living room and say, all right, here's your first key. I want you to go from this key to this key. And I remember the first time she did that with me, and I just sat there. She said, well, don't sit there, do something. Just put your hands on the keys, just bang, just do something.
Yeah.
Just think about, you know, what common note, what is it? Start thinking. She said, start thinking. And pretty soon, I was, you know, playing a few chords to get from one key to another key, and what do you think I do here? What do you think I do here every week? We finish one composition, and if we're going to go right into something else, I figure out a transition, and I figure out the fewest chords to get me where we need to go.
Well, the compositions are arguably the easier part too, but maybe you can speak a little bit about Jewish music and Jewish modes and the art of accompanying the Jewish modes, because they don't often fit within like a major or minor scale, and you need to have a specific skill set in order to be a synagogue accompanist, or to work with a cantor, or to even, you know, do your own Jewish composition.
That's one of the things that I acquired and I learned from my predecessor, from Erwin Josby, who was a master. He taught me several things. One was accompanying the quote-unquote Jewish modes. Another was the art of accompanying chazanut, cantorial literature, at the organ, which is a little different than accompanying at the piano. And the other almost overriding thing that he impressed upon me was that the organ is a wind instrument. And above all else, you need to breathe with the singers. Doesn't matter what's in the accompaniment. You need to breathe with the singers.
You know, and that's something that I think you often don't get credit for, is you are a master of Jewish music. You're not just an accompanist, but you have this music within your soul. I'll never forget, like the first time when we were meeting, I auditioned for this job here. I think it was March of 2012. And I was set to start here in July of 2012, and we had the high holidays just 1 month later. And I had my training as a cantorial student in a non-denominational cantorial school, but I was raised a Reformed Jew. I had been a Reformed cantor. So in order to really get ready to daven properly and to sing the liturgy of conservative Judaism, especially here at Sinai Temple, I relied on you and your coaching and your ability to help me dive into the music and really get to the ikar, to the essence of what it is. So I just wanted to say that you are a true master interpreter of Jewish music, and I think that comes from experience and a deep love of the music.
The influences have been so great, not just from Erwin Josby and from Cantor, but the man who I studied with for my actual grounding of organ technique.
Lad Thomas?
Dr. Lad Thomas.
Yeah.
Who is still the organist at Glendale Methodist Church.
He must be in his 80s now.
Longer than my
Wow.
tenure. He's well over 50 years.
Wow.
As organist there. And my lessons, talk about dedication. My lessons with him were Friday mornings at 7 a.m. at the church in Glendale for several years. And I learned proper pedal technique, and I learned the art of registration. That's what you were asking about before. All of those draw knobs that you see and the different sounds that they represent, how to combine them, how to use them on the different manuals, including the bass pedals, the bass ranks, and how to maybe connect one manual to another, or all of those kinds of things. I learned most of that from him. And then there was another man who substituted for my predecessor, Erwin Josby, and his name was Bob Mitchell. And he also substituted for me for quite a number of years. But I watched him when he substituted for Erwin, and I could see some of the things as a theater organist, what he used to do on the original horseshoe console of the Robert Morton organ back here.
Well, this was a theater organ too.
Yeah.
The organ used to be in a silent movie theater. We can imagine that.
Yes, it was at a theater that went defunct and then was moved over to.
Amazing. From
New Hampshire.
theater to synagogue.
But I would watch him, and of course I would see him do some finger substitution. I would see, which stops he would choose for different things, and he would just by hand do that because, the console had already gotten so old that the pistons weren't reliable anymore. But I also saw what he was doing with his feet and what he would do with the crescendo pedal. And I could see how he accented certain things and then brought the organ up and brought it back down again. And that influenced, all of these things influenced what became my style on how I accompany services. And what I do. And yes, I used to see Bob Mitchell do some glissandi, and I would see, how he would do certain things. And yes, I do some of those things.
That is now the Aryell Cohen Glissando. not to be mistaken, the Aryell Cohen Glissando. And by the way, if people who are watching this interview are not familiar with Ariel's playing, I'm proud to say that a few years ago we did many professional recordings of the music of Sinai Temple, and those are all on YouTube, and you can see Ariel truly making magic and making music on the organ. So I encourage you to watch.
I think those recordings that you and I had the good fortune to create together, those are the definitive recordings of my career, without question. Every year there would be services, we would do some things that I thought came out extraordinarily well, and I would think to myself, I wonder if the recording is okay. I wonder if the recording is good. I wonder, and of course they never really were. So this was the first opportunity that we had to really create something like this. And I'm grateful to you that we were able to do that. And I'm grateful that we have a testament to actually the music program of this synagogue.
And I'm grateful to the many members and congregants who contributed to help make that happen through the CD project. And we were able to, I know this was Dr. Malcolm Cosgrove's idea. He was past president of Sinai Temple.
You're pointing to where
he sits right over there, always sits over there. Yeah. I don't know if that was behind where you sat or in front of Ruth Pilot, but yeah, the Mandels over there, the Cosgroves over there, Dr. Hopp over there. You see them all, and the Flesh and the Burketts and the Ordens. So then you got it. I love it. But it was his idea. He was actually the chair of the cantorial search committee who hired me, and I think my predecessors too, potentially. So he's very involved in music, and he said, Cantor, you need to put out a CD of music of Sinai Temple and put it on all of our seats for the high holidays. I was like, oh, okay. And so it's through that project that we were able to do some of the definitive recordings of Sinai Temple. And that's something to mention too, that the music that we recorded, 90% of it was written here in this building for this synagogue by its cantors, music directors, and organists. I mean, how many other institutions can say that?
Very few.
Very few. And you worked with almost all of them. You worked with Max Feldman through inheriting his quartet. You worked with Erwin Josby and his compositions too. The music of Mayor Finkelstein, we can probably talk about that a little bit. So I think in partnership with you, he composed over 100 settings of Jewish liturgical music at Sinai Temple.
Yes. I do want to go back and give tribute to the man that I had mentioned about the mortgage burning at 4th New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Is Adolf Weinberg.
Ah, you remembered his name.
Yeah, Adolf Weinberg was his name. And he was quite an important figure during that whole transition period from the 50s and 60s from 4th and New Hampshire here, as were others, but he was quite a colorful personality. But yes, Cantor Erskine wrote very, very many compositions, and there are numerous settings that are staple, that we continue to sing every single week here.
Exactly.
How do we do a Kedusha without his setting of Hu Eloheinu?
Cannot.
It's like, you don't.
And all of Shacharit, the Chati Kaddish, these so singable, these beautiful melodies that no wonder the B'nai Mitzvah can lead the service so successfully because of the beautiful composition of Cantor Erskine.
And I've been teaching the children that same Shacharit for 51 years now.
51 years. So you started teaching here at Sinai Temple in 1970, is that correct?
1970.
1970.
What happened was Wayne Freeman had been working with Cantor Erskine, that is deceased past president Dr. Jerry Freeman, Jerry and Tamar Freeman. He was the eldest child of the Freeman family. And he had been working with Cantor Erskine and teaching the B'nai Mitzvah students. But he was going to go to medical school. And he really didn't have time to devote to this anymore. I had found out all of this subsequently, afterwards. And so Cantor Erskine was looking for somebody else, to work with him. One day, the phone rings at home, and he calls and asks for me. So my mother says, Cantor Erskine's on the phone, wants to speak to you. I revered this man. I would do anything for him. Now, I hadn't been to the synagogue for a couple of years, actually.
Were you still a teenager at this point, no?
I was a teenager, yeah. So he asked if I would come and see him. He gave me a day and a time. I said, sure, I'd be happy to. So I came to the synagogue, I came to see him. And he had a bunch of children in there with him. And he said, this one needs to work on the blessings over the Torah. Can you help me? Can you do that? Because he knew that I knew that stuff, that I remembered it, and he knew that I was a musician. He knew that I studied the piano. So I did, and I spent a little bit of time, and then I needed to excuse myself, and I left and didn't think about it again. The next week he calls me and asks again if I would come.
Do it again, yeah.
So I did the same thing, and I forget how many times that occurred, and then one of those times, he just looked at me and said, Rabbi Merritt would like to see you. So go ahead and go to the school office and see what he wants. Cantor Erstein could not bring himself to talk about business, to talk about money.
Really?
And so, and I didn't know that this was going to happen, but I go into the school office and the secretary looks up and smiles and said, oh yes, Rabbi Merritt is expecting you. Just have a seat, I'll let him know that you're here. So she goes in and he comes right out and he says, Ariel, come in and talk to me for a minute. So listen, when you get called into the principal's office, most of the time, is it ever for a good reason?
No.
Now, when we were kids, Howard and I, when I got into trouble, it was Hannah Lippert who took care of me. She was like a second mother. When Howard got into trouble, because his father, ran the school back in those days when we were little, he said,
Jules Lessner,
I'll take care of you when you get home.
And as a fun fact, to have a little Lador Vador moment, Howie, who you grew up with, he became my elementary school principal at Stephen Weiss. So he was my principal growing up too. So to be able to work with him here, and he's just finishing his tenure now as the executive director for over 20 years. So it's a true small world.
So getting back to Rabbi Merritt, so I go in, he closes the door, and we sit down, and he said, Ariel, Cantor Erstein would like you to start working with him to teach our bar and bat mitzvah children. And we're going to pay you so much per hour to start doing this. And they set something up with however many hours a day in a week I was going to do that. And so that's how that began. So I started to come in every afternoon and work with whoever it is that he put me with. And also, I learned so much apprenticing with him, not just about the teaching, not just about the Torah cantillation or Haftarah cantillation, which I studied and learned from him. And he had learned this from Rozovsky.
Oh,
so
wow.
what I got, and don't forget that Cantor Erstein was also a 6th generation Jerusalemite. His Hebrew was not just impeccable. To listen to him read or speak in Hebrew was like liquid gold coming out of this man's mouth. It was unbelievable. The hat and the ayin and how he would
the
speak
real one, yeah.
in a baritone, beautiful baritone voice. His speaking voice was still beautiful. His vocally he was waning, but to listen to his speaking voice was still absolutely beautiful. So I learned these things by necessity in order to help him. Haftarah cantillation, Torah cantillation. And then there were others that he was helping to learn to read the Torah for the High Holy Days. So then I learned
High Holiday
the
cantillation,
High Holy Day cantillation. And then Purim would be coming.
Megillat Esther, yeah.
Megillat Esther. So I would have to help him teach the children that were going to be called on to read part of the Megillah for their Purim assemblies here in the sanctuary. So all of this became part of the work that I was doing with him. And then in 1971, I guess it was just that following year, that was his last year, he began what was called the Shachrit Choir. And he started to have rehearsals on Friday afternoon with them. And they came and sang almost every Saturday morning. And we began teaching Shachrit to the B'nai Mitzvah. And he would have me accompany at his little spinet piano in there for the rehearsals in order to get the children to really be on pitch. And even though I wasn't playing at services, it helped, it did the job. It got the children on pitch, had them singing all together in unison, and he actually did a couple of things in harmony with them, which we don't do anymore. We've changed a few of the melodies over the years, but most of it is still his rendition of the Shachrit morning service, and so I learned all of the liturgy from him, weekday liturgy, because he would work with the sisterhood women to, when the sisterhood did their
Rosh Chodesh or?
their conventions, and the Sinai Temple Sisterhood actually led services for the National Convention one year, and Cantor and I went down there and worked with the women and accompanied them, and so there was all of this that I did in those couple of years that I worked with him until he retired in '72, and then of course Cantor Joseph Gold comes in, and I continue teaching.
So I want to ask you about that. What were those transitions like? Because it seems like in the early 1970s, you were coming into, a musical landscape that was already set. That the Cantor was already set. You were following in the footsteps of Erwin Josby. And then in 1972 or 1973, we have a brand new Cantor that comes in. So what was the feeling like with Cantor Gold coming in at, a young man, 26 years old, coming to succeed his predecessor, Cantor Erskine?
Well, of course, the ethos, the sound is different from a tenor cantor as opposed to a baritone cantor who had been here for 25 years.
Yeah.
Not bad different, just different. And then, of course, because Joe was a tenor, not a baritone, the keys needed to be raised for certain things, and of course, Erwin did that, and actually rearranged a few things for the choir in order for them to be, in order for some of the choral settings to be more appropriate for a new key. And some different settings altogether, like Birkat HaChodesh, that suited Joe better than something that Cantor Erskine
Did Cantor Erskine sing his own Birkat HaChodesh?
Yes, he did.
That makes sense. And then Cantor Gold brought in the Rabinovich.
Yes.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And Erwin Josby created the choral setting for that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, that one, and is the Av HaRachamim that we do on Kever Avot, is that also his arrangement?
Yes.
Stunning.
That's also Erwin Josby's choral setting.
An amazing arranger.
Yeah.
And you too. I mean, the arrangements that you did, especially with Cantor Finkelstein's music in the 1980s and 90s, it's some of the best. Truly some of the best.
Well, we had really quite a wonderful 18-year collaboration. When Mayer first started writing, I think he was writing mostly sitting at the piano. And, you have the sostenuto pedal and, those kinds of things. And when you take the music and then you bring it to the organ and sit down and start to play, you can't play it exactly the way it was notated, because it would have sounded very choppy. So I brought him to sit next to me, on a number of occasions, and I would at sight make adjustments for how it needed to be written, so it would be for keyboard instead of just piano, and it was a lot more adaptable, and also some of the enharmonics of sitting and writing. Is it E flat or D sharp?
Yes,
is it ascending or descending? Is it,
of course,
those kinds of things. And so I paid attention to those kinds of things, and eventually we had the good fortune to publish a couple of things through Transcontinental. I had a very nice relationship with Dr. Judith Tischler, who was the senior editor of Transcontinental at the time. And I think you were going to ask me about L'Ador Vador.
I definitely want to ask that, because and just to set this up, I mean, I interviewed Mayer Finkelstein, almost the same way as what we're doing right now, and I said, how was it that you were able to write so many beautiful, memorable and defining pieces of Jewish music here at Sinai Temple? And he said, it's because with Ariel and the choir, I had a blank canvas, and he was able to paint Jewish music.
We were his laboratory.
You were his laboratory.
We were his laboratory, and the same thing for Cantor Erskine.
And probably Feldman too.
Dr. Sendry and Erwin Josby and the quartet, they were his laboratory. And he would write something, and they would do it, and then he would either edit it or change some things, because this was his laboratory, and he, had the wherewithal to be able to do that.
So in the laboratory, the most famous specimen to ever come out of this laboratory is, of course, Ledor Vador, Ledor Vador, which is not only heard here at Sinai Temple every Shabbat morning, but arguably throughout the entire Jewish world. It has become definitive of not only conservative Jewish liturgy, but you'll find it in conservative, Reform, Reconstructionists, even Orthodox synagogues are singing this melody. So what was that like to have Ledor Vador, to arrange that with Cantor Finkelstein, and what was it like hearing it in this room for the very first time? What was that morning like?
It was very special, right from the very first moment. Even though I was back there, and it was palpable to me, even back there, not being able to see into the sanctuary. Don't forget, I didn't have cameras back then. I had 2 mirrors on the console from 1957 Fords that were installed there. And all I could see was the back of the rabbi's head and the back of your head. And if I could see the back of the rabbi's head turned towards you, that was a sign to me that it was time for me to start.
I was ready to go.
I mean, that's all I had. And most of the time, really, I didn't even need that. But when I did, that's what I saw. But, and Mayor will tell you also, this piece took on a life of its own right from the first breath. It just did. And people started swaying back and forth. And then when we were able to bring in the Rogers organ, the digital organ, and create a hybrid, which is a combination of the digital organ and the original pipe organ together. And then I have all of those patches, in the digital patches that I can use. The French horn obligato, the harp, all of those kinds of things, the banks of strings, and
even the piano sounds too.
And this is what Dr. Robert Tall taught me when he installed this installation. And he sat there and he made these patches for me. And Ledor Vador was the first composition that I began to orchestrate in real time. And I have to tell you, my father becomes more right the older I become. You never have a second opportunity to make a first impression. And I practiced for several months, actually, in order
before
to
it was debuted.
No, before I debuted it with the
new patch.
the orchestral accompaniments that I do. And I actually called most, if not all, of the board and let them know that I was doing this, and because I wanted to set up the listening experience. I didn't want anybody to be surprised or shocked, but I wanted people to know that this was something that I was doing. And it ended up being very well accepted. And not only was it well accepted, but they had made some comments. A few people had made some comments. I won't tell you who, but do more of that. Do more of that with other parts of the service, with other prayers, with other compositions. And so I did. And I do.
I can hear it, yeah, for the Sim Shalom 1, the Ya'aleh, the different things that I'm just hearing in my head, like even the Birkat Kohanim, and really wonderful moments. And a side note to that too, I did not grow up at Sinai Temple, but I grew up at Stephen Weiss, just a few miles away, and I remember it was one Shabbat morning that I was here, I don't know if it was for a bar mitzvah or something too, and I walk into the back, and all of a sudden I hear that introduction for Ledor Vador, and I could have sworn there was an orchestra here. I could have sworn. I didn't know what was backstage. I didn't know it was just the man who was heard and not seen behind the console. I didn't know it was just one organist playing a hybrid instrument of electronics and also pipes. I thought, like, okay, there must be a French horn there, a clarinet, strings, vast things. The amount of musical richness that you're able to get out of this instrument was really, really memorable. I won't forget that.
This is again another one of my mentors who wasn't actually professionally a teacher, but by making this installation, Dr. Robert Tall, taught me how to design this and to play in real time. And it was an important turn, an important change for me in the course of my career here as organist. And I'm very grateful that I've had the teachers and the mentors that I've had, in order to give me the skills to do what I've been able to do.
So maybe moving on to what you see now in the present and in the future, what trends have we started to see kind of in Reform Judaism and conservative Judaism? I know so many people are using guitars in services and even bands, and and very few are using organs, some pianos, some a cappella. I'm just wondering from your perspective of being in this industry, in shul biz, as Howie likes to say, for 50 years, what do you notice as current trends and maybe where we should go in the future?
It's not just shul business. It's not just confined to synagogues, either Reform or conservative. This is the umbrella of religious institutions, period. It's been a number of years already that people are searching. They're looking for different ways to create connections through music and how to do that. Some churches have praise bands, and some of them are working, some of them are not. So it's still what's working, what's not working, and people are still searching. And I think Sinai Temple is now in the throes of that too, searching and looking to see how the synagogue wants to reach out in terms of their services and their outreach through services to people, and what that's going to look like and what that's going to sound like.
And that's one of the blessings of Sinai Temple, is that we're a large enough community that we have different types of service, different styles of service. Maybe that's the future too. Maybe there's different style Shabbat services. Maybe there's different things that are tried. It's all in God's hand. It is all in God's hand. Well, this has been an absolute honor and a privilege, and I can't believe it's been over an hour already. I just checked my watch, and we could be here all day, but we're missing a couple of things for a real conversation. We're missing a glass of scotch and a cigar, right? That is the true way to reminisce and to celebrate. But I love you. It's been such an honor and a privilege to be able to sit here and talk with you and to work with you every Shabbat morning. A true honor and a privilege.
And as Shmuel Kellemer used to say, to be continued.
To be continued. Amen.